2021. We have our joke book, Our Damn Rascal, which is only $2. The biography is $20. We have bookmarks, which are only $1, which have quotes from me. And maybe you can see this. This is my joke bookmark, which has me in a little party hat. Okay. And we also have free things like this little bio on myself here. That's free. And we also have little rack cards here about my museum in Gettysburg, Thad's place. And that's open Wednesday through Sunday. We also have a free thing here, which actually requires you to spend a little money because it is a postcard asking for a stamp for me. Believe it or not, I do not have a stamp. So we've been trying for 25 years to convince the post office to get me a stamp. And if you'd like to be on our email list, I have a little form that you can sign giving us your email. We send out 1 or 2 emails a month, including a column about Thaddeus Stevens. So with that said, I'd like to know how many people know who I am. You know who I am. Okay, well, what do you know about me? Not that much.
I know you were an abolitionist.
Okay.
You were in the film.
Okay, a lot of you.
That was interesting.
That's sort of
I
about.
knew the connections, but you were very good in that.
Oh, thank you, appreciate that. So that.
You were an important
Character.
in the whole.
You had a housekeeper named Lydia Hamilton Smith?
Yes, she was my housekeeper. Okay, and I'll talk more about that, about how she got libeled by my enemies. I'll tell you more about that. I don't want to spoil that. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was the most powerful congressman during and after the Civil War. I helped to persuade Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. I was instrumental in the passage of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, as shown in the movie Lincoln, where I was ably portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones, but I did not have a Texas drawl. And let me grab my cane. I don't want to fall down here. Yeah, southern Pennsylvania. Actually, I was originally from Vermont. So, in any case, yes. I was the father of the 14th Amendment, the single most important amendment to the Constitution, requiring equal treatment under the law and also extending the Bill of Rights to the state level, spearheaded the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, and was one of the architects of Reconstruction. I have been called the 17th and a half president because I led a veto-proof Congress against Andrew Johnson and prevented him from losing the Civil War after the Civil War. Now I'm going to talk to you about my experiences with 3 presidents. James Buchanan, who happened to live in the same city as I did, Lancaster, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Johnson. Now, James Buchanan, interestingly, our lives were very similar. We were actually born within months of each other in the early 1790s, and we actually died within months of each other in 1860. Me in 1868, he in 1867. However, we were these damn things. Let me ignore them. If they're interested, they'll leave a message. So, anyway, maybe I should turn this off so I'm not interrupted again. Just a second. Okay. See, I'm still kind of ancient. Flip phone. I don't believe in those smartphones. So in any case, yeah, we're very similar. However, beyond that, we were completely different. He was a Democrat. You might actually call him what was the something face? Dough face. He was a dough face. He was a Northern Democrat who basically did what the Southern Democrats told him to do. And actually, he tried to persuade me to be a Democrat in my early political career. But of course, I wasn't going to be a Democrat at that time because that was at the slave party at that time. As you well know, things have changed dramatically since then. I don't think I would fit into the Republican Party at this time. But in any case, James Buchanan ran for president in 1856 when I was living in Lancaster. And I told people when I campaigned against him, I was campaigning for John Charles Fremont, the Republican candidate, the first Republican candidate. Unfortunately, he did not get elected president. And I told people at the time, I said, there is a misconception about the Democratic candidate. He has died of lockjaw, and all that's left is a pile of political putridity. So in any case, he did get elected, okay? And at the same time, 2 years later, I was elected as a Republican to the House of Representatives. And so sometimes I would be talking in Congress about Mr. Buchanan's policies. And I would talk extensively about them. And another congressman one time challenged me. He said, why do you think you can talk so much about Mr. Buchanan's policies? I said, well, you have to understand, he is a constituent of mine. And they said, well, I certainly hope you represent your other constituents better than you represent James Buchanan. So in any case, James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln became president in 1860. And James Buchanan cemented the title of one of the worst presidents because he had inaction. He wouldn't take action against the seceding states. And he did even more than that. He actually sat on his hands as the Confederacy took various forts in the South. And I said at the time, I said, I cannot believe this. I cannot believe that he intentionally sat on his hands and let the Confederates take these forts. Because if that is true, he is a worse traitor than Benedict Arnold, and every drop of blood in the ensuing struggle will set heavy on his soul. So I didn't think he could even do that, but he did. So anyway, we got Abraham Lincoln, right? And as I tell people, the Union had two political geniuses, Abraham Lincoln and yours truly. And much of Abraham Lincoln's genius was that he listened to me. Now, at the beginning of the war, and on two occasions, he was not for freeing the slaves initially, and he was not for using black soldiers initially. But he came around to my position, and interestingly, me and two other abolitionist congressmen, Charles Sumner and Henry Wilson from Massachusetts, would regularly go up to urge Abraham Lincoln to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, he got really kind of irritated by us three guys coming up there all the time saying, come on, you got to do this, you got to do this. And in fact, he would tell friends about how it reminded him of a one-room school where they would learn how to read by going around a circle reading from the scriptures. And on one occasion, this young boy named Bud had to read a passage that involved Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, which is hard enough for me to pronounce, much less for a 9-year-old. So he completely messed up on them, which earned him a whack upside the head from the schoolmaster. They were not too enlightened back in those days. And he yelled, but he settled down. They started going back around the circle, and they got back to Bud, and Bud looked at what he had to read, and he lets out this scream. And the master says, what's the matter, Bud? And Bud says, look, master, here comes those damn three fellows again. So we eventually got him to agree to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, okay? On occasion, Abraham Lincoln would ask me about other things. He would seek my advice on other things. And one time he asked me about the wisdom of, or not the wisdom, the honesty of Simon Cameron. Or anybody here know who Simon Cameron was? Do you know who Simon Cameron was?
Well, he was from Maytown.
He was from what?
Maytown.
Okay.
That's about all.
Okay. Anybody else know anything about him? Secretary of War. Did I hear corrupt? A little bit. Okay. Well, Lincoln asked me about how corrupt he was. And I said, well, all I can say is he wouldn't steal a red hot stove. And Lincoln thought that was pretty funny. So he told Cameron, who didn't think it was very funny. And he demanded that I go back and tell Lincoln that was not so. And I said, oh, okay, settle down. So I went back to Lincoln and I said, you know how I told you he wouldn't steal a red hot stove? Lincoln said, yes. And I said, well, I was wrong. He would. So Lincoln, taking my advice, finally sent Cameron off to Russia as ambassador. And when I heard that, I said, send word to the Tsar to bring in his things at night. So unfortunately, one of the things that he did not take my advice on, which he really should have, was on changing his vice presidents from the good Republican Hannibal Hamlin to Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat. Now, for people who are not steeped in Civil War history, why would the Republicans get a Southern Democrat who we were fighting, okay? Well, you have to understand that in the mid-1864, it looked like we were going to lose the Republican Party. The war wasn't going all that well. And we felt, and also emancipation was very unpopular, okay? And so the Republican Party thought that they would broaden their appeal by actually changing the name of the party. They became the Union Party, okay? And they thought they could get more votes if they had a more centralist vice president. And Andrew Johnson was kind of a star in the North because he was the only Southern senator, he was from Tennessee, who did not leave the Senate. He was against secession, but he was kind of okay with slavery, which is kind of weird with being a slaveholder. He was a tailor. Okay, what does a tailor need with a slave? And the story is that he bought a slave down in Tennessee as a status symbol. And he went to a slave auction, and a particular woman, black woman, saw him and liked the way he looked. So she came over to him and said, "You're going to buy me." And he did. So his relationship with his slaves was not as cruel as it might have been, but obviously he was from the South. He was down with slavery, though he did get rid of his slaves near the end of the war. So, as you may know, he became the vice president. He disgraced himself at his inauguration by showing up drunk, okay? And so then, of course, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, okay? Which really caused a great dilemma for the Union. As I said, he was a Southern Democrat, and he started issuing pardons wholesale to all of the ex-Confederates. And he allowed them to hold elections in the South. And they elected Confederate officials. In fact, the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, no relation to me. In fact, he spells his last name wrong. He was elected to the Senate. But, and they planned on taking over Congress with the aid of their Northern Democratic allies. And one of the things they were going to do was to allow the reinstatement of slavery in the South. Right after the Civil War, Southern states passed these laws called the Black Codes. Has anybody heard of the Black Codes? Nope. Okay. Incredibly bad laws. they only applied to blacks, didn't apply to whites. And they said, if you're black and you don't have a job, you're automatically a vagrant and can be put back onto the plantation as convict labor. This was done to get around the 13th Amendment, which outlawed involuntary servitude, except if you're a convict. So these were the stakes when Congress reconvened on December 4th, 1865. For 8 months, Andrew Johnson had a free hand. He could do anything he wanted. But as the person who basically ran Congress, I was not going to allow the Southerners to take over. So I came up with a plan with the clerk of the House of Representatives, who happened to be my longtime protege, who I had known since birth in Gettysburg, Edward McPherson. And at my direction, good old Edward called out the names of the new members, and he got to the Southern names, and he skipped them, just didn't call them out. The Southerners and their allies jumped up and down and said, you can't do that, you can't do that. I got up and I said, point of order, we can conduct no business until the roll is finished. The roll is finished, the Southerners are out, giving the Republicans a supermajority in the House of Representatives to block Andrew Johnson from losing the Civil War after the Civil War. That was the most significant day in my legislative career, because without that day, I wouldn't have been able to do the other great things that I did. And if Johnson had had his way, we would have gone back to the way things were before the Civil War, complete with a new form of slavery. Instead, we went towards our current society with its rights and protections. Now, you might think, that sounds kind of fishy, the way that happened. Actually, it wasn't. It was completely legal. Johnson had overstepped his authority by holding elections in the South, because it's clear in the main part of the Constitution that Congress decides who's in Congress, not the president. That is simple separation of powers. Two, oh, I just thought you might have a question. Okay, that's all right. I didn't mean to embarrass you. Okay, so in any case, the two is that, I gotta get my train of thought back here. Two, the South had seceded, set up a government, and had been conquered. Therefore, they were conquered territories. They had given up their rights as states and couldn't just waltz back in as if nothing happened. And then Congress had anticipated this happening, so we had given the clerk the discretion to reject anybody who did not have the proper credentials. So, but it took me to do the whole parliamentary procedure. Any questions on that? Nope. Okay, I guess I'm very clear today. So in any case, because we were able to do this, we were able to pass the 14th Amendment, which is my greatest achievement and my greatest disappointment. Does anybody here know what the 14th Amendment is? Or just want to, okay, yes. Nope, that's 13th, that's 15th Amendment. That's voting. 13th, I'll give you some hints. 13th freed the slaves. 15th gave them, 15th gave them the vote. Very good. Equal rights, very important. As everybody does know, the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, but it was a lie for the first 90 years. The 14th Amendment actually put it into law, saying that you couldn't make specific laws for specific people like they did with the black codes. Anything else?
Wasn't it how the slaves became citizens?
Birthright citizenship. Okay, which also applied. We also discussed the fact that immigrants would also be covered by that birthright citizenship. It also extends the Bill of Rights to the state level. The Bill of Rights, freedom of press, freedom of religion, before the 14th Amendment only applied to the federal government. There was no freedom of the press in the South before the 14th Amendment. Basically, if you tried to put out a abolitionist newspaper in the South before the Civil War, you were shut down immediately. Just no freedom of the press. So 14th Amendment, very important. There's some other parts which I won't go into, but I introduced the 14th Amendment, but of course it got changed around as it went through. And if they had adopted one of my early proposals, women would have gotten the vote 50 years before they did, okay? And it was an interesting way I was going to do that. The Constitution originally based representation in Congress and in the Electoral College on the whole number of people plus 3/5 of the slaves. The 3/5 compromise, so to say, was thrown out after slavery was done away with. However, we still continued to count whole number of people for representation, even though those whole number of people were, half of them were women who could not vote. So I had the radical idea of counting only the eligible voters, which were only white men at that time, for representation. If we had adopted that, then smaller states like Rhode Island could have doubled their representation by simply giving the vote to women, okay? But in other states would have to follow suit, otherwise they would lose proportional representation. That was my intention, that the states would adopt this on their own. Well, I was not clever enough to keep that away from the other congressmen, so they figured it out. And they actually went in the opposite direction. And they put the word male into the 14th Amendment, and it's still there, as a prerequisite for voting. And I was outraged by that. I said, I just don't understand this at all. All of the bachelors, like myself, a thing, by the way, I shared with James Buchanan, all the bachelors were against putting male in there. It was just the married guys that wanted to put male in there. What was their problem with women? And I actually was so outraged, I threatened to vote against my own amendment for that and other reasons. But in the end, I said, this is the best we're going to be able to get, so I accept it. Now, at the beginning of the talk, I said that some people call me the 17th and a half president. Believe it or not, that is not an exaggeration. Lots of people said that my power was equivalent to the president. However, I was not Speaker of the House, a mistake a lot of people make. I was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a powerful committee, but that really didn't give me the power that I wielded. My power came from three different things. One, my unparalleled ability with parliamentary procedure or the rules of the House of Representatives, which got things through that otherwise wouldn't have. Two, I was the leader of the radical Republicans in the House, a minority group, but we would vote as a bloc, which gave us extra power. And the third, and most important, yet the most amorphous, was my sheer force of character. And I would like to show that. I'd like to read from this 1866 Harper's Weekly article. Another more modern inconvenience. We didn't have those back then. And another one of my unsmiling pictures. You're never going to see any picture of me smiling. A couple of reasons. One, back then, photography back then didn't want you to smile, because if you did smile, you might mess up the picture because of the long exposures. And also in my early political career in Gettysburg, I was told the people of German descent around there did not like smiling candidates. As they say, the thinnest book in the library is 250 years of German humor. So in any case, this is what it says about me. That which gives Mr. Stevens the great power which he wields in the House, a power which is almost irresistible, is his emphatic and earnest denunciation of treason. The country has suffered so much in the past from vacillation that it greatly admires anything which looks thorough and straightforward. Mr. Stevens' words have a gladiatorial strength which would have done honor to the boldest of Rome's orators. They sway men by their sledgehammer strokes. They are words of iron. Whatever be the verdict of posterity in regard to the wisdom of Mr. Stevens' acts and speeches, future generations cannot fail to render him the tribute which is always yielded to extraordinary force of character. Sometimes I blush when I read that. So, any case, you may be wondering, why am I not as well known as Abraham Lincoln? In fact, a few historians actually say that I deserve the title of the great emancipator as much as Abraham Lincoln. I don't want to take away from his luster. In fact, sometimes his admirers get rather upset when people say that about me because they want all the glory for Abraham Lincoln. But so does anybody have any idea why I am not better known?
You weren't president like he was.
Very good. That is a great thing because we only study presidents. We don't study members of Congress, okay? But there was something that even targeted me more and destroyed my reputation. Do you know what that might be?
Was it Mrs. Smith?
No, it wasn't that.
Thank goodness.
Okay, well, that was sort of one of the things. Okay, I'll go into that a little bit later. It was I was targeted by one of the most, if not the most successful propaganda efforts in human history, which probably is ongoing and you're not even really aware of it, which is the lost cause mythology. Has anybody heard that particular term? No. That's where the ex-Confederates went back to the South, rewrote the history of the Civil War, saying it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, and then they started putting up all of their statues to all of their Confederate heroes. That was not done by accident. It was very deliberate, very concerted, okay? And they particularly targeted me because I was associated with Reconstruction, which they said was Northern vengeance when it was actually trying to protect the newly freed slaves. One of the best examples of this targeting of me was this 1905 best-selling book called The Klansman, okay? You can sort of figure out from the title what it's about. And they have a character in there called Austin Stoneman, which is clearly me, down to the wig. And I am the villain, and the heroes are the Ku Klux Klan. But there's an even more insidious villain in this book than myself. Can you guess who that might be? Everybody guesses Lincoln, and everybody's wrong. It's a trick question. In fact, at the beginning of the book, they have a list of characters, and they have Abraham Lincoln, the friend of the South. Okay? I guess they didn't want to mess with a martyr. But in any case, in this book, they say if Lincoln had survived, he would have let the South back in as if nothing had happened, and they could have oppressed the newly freed slaves as much as they wanted. Instead, they got me, this meanie, who insisted on them respecting the rights of the newly freed slaves. And the more insidious villain in this book, and worse than Benedict Arnold, is my poor biracial housekeeper, okay? And this is what this novel had to say about her. No more curious or sinister figure ever cast a shadow across the history of a great nation than did this mulatto woman in the most corrupt hour of American life. The grim old man who looked into her sleek, tawny face and followed her cat-like eyes was steadily gripping the nation by the throat. Did he aim to make this woman the arbiter of its social life and her ethics the limits of its moral laws? During my lifetime, my enemies said no white man is going to be for equality like I was unless I was being misled by a black woman, okay? Which is kind of ridiculous when you think about it, because if all it takes to become an abolitionist is the favors of a black woman, then more than half of the slave owners would have been abolitionists. So I denied it, and my housekeeper, who was a devout Roman Catholic and very proud of her good reputation, vehemently denied it, and actually confronted an editor and threatened to cowhide him if he continued to publish such libels. That accusation against me faded away after my death. And but this book, remember, 1905 bestseller, revived it. That book was made into plays and one of the most famous movies ever made, which is The Birth of a Nation. How many people have heard of that movie? Okay, lots of you. That was the most advanced film of its day, having pioneering such techniques as close-ups, rapid cutting, tracking shots. It was shown in the White House, where Woodrow Wilson said it was like watching history written in lightning. It also retains the title all these years later of being the most racist film ever made. It has me, like the book, as the villain and the heroes of the Ku Klux Klan, which come riding to the rescue of a town being taken over by a black mob. That movie helped to revive the Ku Klux Klan to become a national organization with millions of members. And in you can still see film clips from the 1920s of thousands of hooded Ku Klux Klan members parading through Washington, D.C. That movie did that. It also revived that slur against me and my housekeeper, and has a scene in the movie where I am getting affectionate with my housekeeper, and a title comes up saying, "A great man's weakness is the blight of a nation." As a result of that very influential film, biographers felt compelled to address the relationship. Most have said there's no evidence of a romantic relationship, though others have said there might be using questionable evidence. Now, that movie was followed by another movie called Tennessee Johnson in 1942, which was about the life of Andrew Johnson, where he is the hero and I'm the villain again because I tried to have him removed. And at one point, the Andrew Johnson character accuses me of trying to enslave white Southerners. I'm played in that movie by Lionel Barrymore. How many people know who Lionel Barrymore? Okay, he is Drew Barrymore's grand uncle, and also played Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life, the evil banker in the wheelchair. Finally, I was a hero in the Lincoln movie, okay? And my fan club was really excited about that. I'm in the movie because Tony Kushner, the person who wrote the screenplay, is a big fan of mine. Unfortunately, they have a scene in that movie where I'm jumping into bed with my housekeeper. That is pure fantasy, okay? Never happened. Tony Kushner, the screenwriter, was just exercising his poetic license. Now, but not only was I made a villain in the movies and in the popular novels, the historic community and academia also was against me. They basically said that Reconstruction was a disaster, that the newly freed slaves shouldn't have been given political power, that nothing good came out of Reconstruction. It was only starting in the 1970s that the historic community started to reevaluate that. And just to show you what things were like up until the late 1960s, let me read you the preface of a biography written in 1967. This is the biography, Thaddeus Stevens and the Fight for Negro Rights. As you can see, the title is a little dated. And at least we moved beyond colored. So this is what the author said my reputation was: wicked, wretched, evil, hard, malignant, vindictive, domineering, revengeful, unforgiving, implacable, cunning, mad. Thaddeus Stevens has been called all these names and more. He can lay claim to being one of the best hated men in our past. One historian has said Stevens was, quote, perhaps the most despicable, malevolent, and morally deformed character who has ever risen to high power in America. The harsh judgments his enemies made in his lifetime still echo in the textbooks students use now, 1967. What did this man do to deserve this? He fought to establish free public schools. He defended fugitive slaves in the court. He championed the right of free speeches for dissenters. He spoke up for unpopular minorities, Indians, Mormons, Jews, and Negroes. He led the political struggle to free the slaves and to protect their rights through the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. And he tried to restructure the defeated South on a foundation of justice for all and a democracy of true equality. If this is what he stood for, why do so many Americans detest him? Bear in mind, this is 1967. Why, for that matter, is Robert E. Lee, who led armies in a bloody war to preserve slavery, called a saint, while Stevens, who warred against slavery, is called a devil? Things have changed since then, and I'm getting better press these days. And we also have a museum over in Gettysburg, which is opened up in 2024. We have a statue over there also. And there's a new museum in Lancaster, which opened up on May 1st. And there's also a statue at the Thaddeus Stevens College of Technology. Now, as you can imagine, I was a very controversial figure back in my day, and I had a lot of political enemies. I particularly remember one time I'm walking down a narrow sidewalk in Lancaster, and a political enemy who went on to write a very nasty biography on me was coming towards me, and he stopped and he scowled at me and he said, "I never stand aside for a skunk." And I stepped off the curb and I said, "But I always do." Now, of course, I also had a lot of admirers, okay? And I particularly remember one time a lady came up to me and said, "Oh, Mr. Stevens, I'm such a great admirer of yours. Can I have a lock of your hair?" And I said, "Sure, have the whole thing." So just to let you know, I started wearing a wig in the 1830s after I had typhoid fever, which rendered me hairless. That's why you never saw me joining in with everybody else and having beards. At that time, I was always, clean shaven because I couldn't grow a beard. And I started wearing a wig because in the 1830s, wigs were still a thing. You had some of our founding fathers like Madison and Monroe still wore wigs. So I started wearing a wig, and I just kept wearing a wig for the rest of my life. But I was kind of sloppy with it. I had it cut so that I could put it on any way, and it would always look about the same. So, but I feel like I got the last word because I insisted on being buried in the only cemetery in Lancaster at the time that was open to both whites and blacks. And my epitaph actually says why I am there. And it says, "I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race by charter rules, I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life, equality of man before his creator." Meant that to be a very inspirational epitaph. Now, with that said, I open it up for your questions. Yes?
What made you, what nurtured your passion for equality?
That's an excellent question. Well, first off, I grew up in Vermont, okay, the first state to abolish slavery. Of course, it was relatively easy since there were no black people in Vermont, okay? So nobody lost any money as a result. Two, my mother was a very devout Baptist, which in that area was very anti-slavery. Also, I grew up with a club foot, which was seen as a mark of the devil. And of course, that caused a lot of discrimination against me, which caused me to be very sympathetic to disadvantaged people. However, when I moved down to Gettysburg, I was a young man on the make, okay? I was eager to become rich, which I became, okay? And in that being so close to the Mason-Dixon line, one of the sources of business was to represent slave owners trying to recover their slaves. Before the passage of the notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it so easy to recover slaves that had actually caused a reverse Underground Railroad. Before that was passed, if a master went up to the north and was trying to recover a slave and a relative or something disputed it, they could take it to court, okay? And the slave owner would hire some local attorney like me to basically get his slave back. Well, on one occasion, there was this woman by the name of Charity Butler who had escaped slavery from Maryland, had come up to Pennsylvania, had married a man by the name of Butler, and had 2 daughters, okay? Several years later, her former master found out where she was, and he attempted to take her back. Well, the husband mounted a legal case saying that she had been brought up to Pennsylvania over a series of times and she should be free. Well, the slave owner hired me to represent him to get his slave back. I was a hell of a lawyer, okay? And I basically demolished the case brought by the husband. And she was going to go back in slavery. But this was a very special case because not only was she going back to slavery, her daughters, who had never been in slavery, would go back with her. That was how evil slavery was. I saw slavery up close and seeing how evil it was. After that particular case, I didn't write about it, but I never represented a slave owner after that. In fact, I started representing fugitive slaves for free after that, and also got into the Underground Railroad, started participating in the Underground Railroad. I didn't make a big deal about that because it was illegal. But my first big proclamation against slavery was at an 1823 July 4th celebration, where I said, may the next president be a free man who never riveted fetters on a human being. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't sound that spectacular, but you have to understand at that point of the 5 presidents, 4 of them were slave owners. So that was quite a revolutionary statement at that time. But that started my 40-year effort to get rid of slavery.
You just finally mentioned the clubfoot disorder.
Yes.
How did you accomplish all this while working through that without the miracles of modern medicine and science?
You'd be amazed. You'd be amazed what clubfoot persons could do. Actually, I was an excellent horseman and actually a very good swimmer. So it was possible to overcome that, but of course it gave me a noticeable limp, whenever I walked. Now, interestingly, later in my life, I actually developed a lot of arthritis, and near the end of my life, when I was trying to impeach Andrew Johnson, or try to removing Andrew Johnson, I was severely incapacitated, okay? And by the way, just sort of as an aside, Andrew Johnson was the first president to be impeached. He was acquitted by 1 vote, okay? And I was outraged by that. And I said at the time, I said, if we could not remove him under these circumstances because we had kept the Southerners out and he was a terrible president, that probably the only way a president could be removed in the future is the way they removed Julius Caesar. But in any case, I had to actually be carried in to the impeachment proceeding, okay? But I was determined to see this through. I would be dead within about 3 months after the impeachment. And I've been carried in to the impeachment by these big, strong guys. And I looked down at them and I said, what am I gonna do when you're dead and gone? So I overcame the clubfoot.
The answer is you mastered.
I mastered it.
Compensation.
Right.
2-part
Okay.
question for you and stuff with that. One, basically, what you viewed as your relationship with Abraham Lincoln, and who did you consider the better orator?
That's a good question. Because I was a very good orator. I just haven't gotten as much play as I probably should have. Abe was, like I said, our relationship was friendly adversary. Okay, I mean, he really didn't like being bugged all the time. In fact, there's some quote, which of course I'm going to screw up, that us abolitionists, like the three guys that kept coming to him, were devils, but we were faced Zion wards, okay? So I was always tough on him, okay? I really didn't think he was moving fast enough or, taking my advice well enough. In fact, people have asked me why I didn't go to the Gettysburg Address, which in retrospect, I probably should have. It would have been a nice gesture, but people asked me why I wasn't going to go there and I said, let the dead bury the dead, which is from the Bible. And at that time, in 1863, I thought the Republican Party was going to lose because of Abraham Lincoln, that he was unpopular, that in fact, I really sort of feel like he should have issued the Emancipation Proclamation earlier than he did, because it was issued in September, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, right before the elections, and it really screwed the Republicans as far as the November elections. And if they had done it a little bit earlier in 1863, or maybe even in 1862, maybe the electorate would have forgotten. Of course, a lot of historians say, oh, Lincoln couldn't issue the Emancipation Proclamation earlier because states like Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Delaware, all slave states, might have left the Union, okay? In fact, Lincoln is famously known for saying a quote, God may be on our side, but Kentucky is more important. So in any case, I just felt he was moving too slow, but he did move. It was a lot better than Andrew Johnson, who was completely against what we were trying to do.
Can I ask you one more thing?
Okay, sure. Ask me as many as you'd like.
Actually, and another two about the 14th Amendment.
Okay.
The first one, I just wanted your viewpoint. We look at Abraham Lincoln as freeing the slaves, but he
Right.
did not believe he believed in slavery early in his career. I'm just.
When you say believe in slavery, what do you mean by that? He didn't object to it, maybe.
Object to it.
Okay.
You know, so-
Not like me, who was like really crazy about it.
Yeah, you were against that kind of part with it. Was there ever a sense of not trusting Lincoln to follow through on trying to free the slaves? And that's why things were delayed. I just always wondered about that and how that transition happened. And guess you always talk about trust upon somebody coming in, and you say, did he realize that it was really a bad position to take?
A bad position, what would be a bad position?
Position that he didn't support eliminating slavery at first, and whether or not.
Well, you realize, okay, I'm not in a position of usually defending Lincoln, okay. Like I said, I think he really was very slow in coming around to the right position. But the people who were slower were the population, okay? And interestingly enough, let me tell you a little something about why he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. I told you about the dreadful three that would keep on urging him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was more than that. Actually, Congress passed the Second Confiscation Act, okay? And it landed on his desk in July. And that actually directed him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He got an order from Congress to do that, okay? And that's when he had a cabinet meeting. And that's when Seward said, well, before we do that, maybe we should win a battle, okay? And because things weren't going that well for so Lincoln said, oh, okay, I'll wait until we win a battle, whenever that's going to be. Well, it wasn't a secret that Congress had directed Lincoln to do this, okay? And Horace Greeley, does anybody here know who Horace Greeley was? Editor of the New York Tribune. He actually wrote an editorial called The Prayer of 20 Million, referring to the 20 million in the North, okay? And basically he said, Lincoln, get off the dime and do what you were told to do. And that's when Lincoln responded in a letter to the Tribune saying, my main effort is to to save the country. If it means freeing some of the slaves, I'll do that. If it means freeing none of the slaves, I'll do that. If it means freeing all of the slaves, I will do that. My main concern is to save the Union. Of course, Lincoln was being completely disingenuous at that point because he had already decided to issue the Emancipation and free all of the slaves in the South. By the way, I don't know if it's not, the Emancipation Proclamation is not that well known, okay? Because one, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued in September. That was the warning to the South. It was saying, hey, you better come back in the Union or I'm going to free your slaves, okay? And actually, if the South had been intelligent, which is, far-fetched, they could have come back into the Union and kept their slaves if they had come back before January 1st. That was what the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation said. And also, you also have to realize this was not something that Congress passed. It was something just that the president put out. And he was allowed to do that because I kept telling him this all the time, because I actually was a much better lawyer than he was. I mean, I figured I could tell you that. In fact, he screwed up all the time. In fact, let me tell you, okay, I'll tell you this. I'll tell you the story about the Emancipation Proclamation. So he was only able to issue that because we were in a war, and under the unwritten rules of the war, a belligerent could take action which would hurt his foe, okay? And so Lincoln, under the rules of war, not under the Constitution, could issue the Emancipation Proclamation because the South was a separate country, okay? But he couldn't do anything about the slaves that were still in the Union or in Union-controlled territories in the South, okay? So slaves that were in Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and Kentucky all continued to be slaves. And even those areas like Hampton Roads, they would, which were under Union control, would continue to be slaves. In New Orleans, they continued to be slaves. So, so it wasn't until the 13th Amendment that we actually got all the slaves freed. Now, just I said that Lincoln kind of screwed up on things, and I had to correct him. Okay, and by the way, that's another thing in the movie Lincoln, where you have me in the kitchen with Lincoln giving me political advice. Absolute, fantasy. If anyone's giving political advice, it's me to Lincoln. Okay, in fact, Lincoln, when he started the war, created an embargo. And keep that word in mind, an embargo on southern ports. And I went to him and I said, you really screwed up. You only put an embargo on foreign ports, okay? If you're contending that the South is still your country, you close the ports. And you might say, well, what difference does it make? It does make a big difference in international, law. And he basically said, well, I'm just an old country lawyer and I don't know anything better than that. So I had to sort of keep, reminding him of the rules of war and such like that. So anyway, that's probably more than you wanted to know.
No, it was just part of it. Can I ask about the 14th Amendment? I'm sorry, I won't.
You wanted to ask about the 14th Amendment?
The 14th Amendment only because of, in that film, Lincoln, which I've watched a number of times.
Yeah, that's about the 13th Amendment, though.
Okay. But there was a phrase used when they tried to corner you in the...
Do I believe in equality in all things?
Yes, and I wonder whether or not that's what led...
Actually, that is true. Actually, I did say at the time in my speech, I wasn't as eloquent in that as the movie had me do, but I was questioned, do you believe in equality in all matters? I said, no, equality in just politics, or equality in, I don't know, equality under the law. Okay, under the law. I didn't believe in equality in social. They actually asked, well, do you believe in equality? Are you going to deny that you believe in equality under the law? I said, no, I'm not. So they tried to push me all the way off that. But I was lying. I believed in equality in all matters, even which is shown in burying in that biracial cemetery.
That was part of your oratory skills, I thought.
Right. I mean, I wasn't above shading the truth whenever I needed to. I knew how to get things through. So,
Appreciate it, thank you.
yes. Any other questions? Oh, okay, yes.
Who do you project would be a good leader after you obviously knew you were sick and that things were coming to an end?
Well, actually, I like Grant afterwards, and actually Grant did a pretty good job of trying to actually enforce Reconstruction.
And I'm a big fan of Garfield. I see he was a major
Yes,
colleague of yours, or
right.
ally. And of course, he was eliminated pretty quickly. Not
Right.
a crazy person, but anyway. But did you have much contact with?
Garfield. I am going to plead that I'm 234 years old, so I don't really remember. I'd have to do some research, go back and read some
Well, he
biographies.
was a major general. A general in the war, and apparently everyone didn't like him. And he didn't even want to run for president. He was kind of
Forced
And
into
I
it.
just wondered if you had any say in that.
I don't remember. Yes.
One of the similarities that you have today with James Buchanan is an ongoing, rather prurient interest in the intimate life of both you and Mr. Buchanan. How does that further history in any way?
I don't know. I really, the only what's the word I'm looking for? The only idea that I have I do know why they said that my housekeeper was my mistress, because they were trying to discredit me. They basically said that I was not really for equality, that I was just doing it because my girlfriend told me to do that, which is really just absolutely ridiculous, because I started my crusade against slavery 20 years before she came to work for me. Okay. Interestingly enough, a little on the side, if you've seen the Lincoln movie, I'm jumping into bed with a black woman. Okay. If they actually had been historically accurate, I would have been jumping into bed with a white woman, because Lydia Hamilton Smith was a very fair person. She was 1/4 black, and actually, during the time that she lived in Lancaster, she identified in census data as a mulatto, but when she moved down to Washington, D.C. and had a boarding house down there, she identified herself as a white person. So that's another inaccuracy of that particular movie.
Yes, that's one of the things that I find so interesting in a movie as contemporary as the Lincoln film was. And I quite often will go to presentations at Lancaster History. And anything on you or anything on Buchanan, as a general rule, there are people in that grouping asking about
About the gay president.
What
you
does
know.
that have to do with you historically? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know, did that?
It did hurt my reputation, in the historic community, and just the general community, particularly because of the birth of a nation and such like that. But also, I just was like in the Tennessee Johnson movie, I was portrayed as just a fanatic, who just wanted, have black people voting who shouldn't have been voting. At least that was the way that the critics of Reconstruction said.
When
So,
it was
but
published about Mrs. Smith in the Lancaster papers, did she prevail in her libel protestations or not?
they backed off. Actually, the article where she said that she was going to cowhide them was a very condescending article, and actually kind of made fun about her. But the Lancaster Intelligencer was the one that went after me, because that was a Democratic paper in Lancaster. I'm not exactly sure whether they had stopped doing that, but I appreciate her going after them.
Did you ever have any aspirations to be president?
No, I never. I actually is interesting, because I always had aspirations to be a senator. And back in those days, you didn't get elected directly senator. You were elected by the legislature. And I could never get enough support in the Pennsylvania legislature to become a senator. But right up to my dying day, I was campaigning to be a senator from Pennsylvania. But frankly, I knew I was just too radical to be president, though I supported people who were more radical than Lincoln, like John Charles Fremont. I mean, I would have liked to have seen him president rather than Lincoln, because frankly, Lincoln was, you had to kind of keep pushing him and so on and so forth, whereas Fremont was very much on board with being against slavery. Of course, he didn't get elected either. So, okay. Well, you've been a great crowd. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
This is Ross Hetrick. As Thaddeus Stevens. So that was fascinating.
Okay. And like I said, I have these things up here, and I have change, and I can, you know.
And thank you for jumping right into your presentation.
Sure.
And we appreciate having you. Could you just quickly tell us a little bit about the museum down in
Oh,
Pittsburgh?
sure. The museum is open. It's a free museum, okay? And it's open Wednesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And if you can't make those hours, you can call the number that's on the rack card here, which is 717-347-8159. And I live right next door, and I'll open it up for you. And we have letters from Thaddeus Stevens there, even a letter that he wrote to Edward McPherson, the guy who helped him keep the Southerners out of Congress. We also have stoves that were made at his 2 different iron mills. Let me tell you about his iron mills just real quick. He owned iron mills from 1826 to 1868 when he died. And that was the worst mistake in his life. He constantly lost money from his iron mills, and that's the reason that he left Gettysburg in 1842 and moved over to Lancaster to make more money as a lawyer in a larger city to pay down the debt. He continued losing money in the 1840s and the 1850s. Then in 1863, Confederate General Jubal Early, on his way to the Battle of Gettysburg, made a special stop there and burnt the place to the ground because of Thaddeus Stevens' abolitionist positions. Could have been worse, because Early said that if he had caught Thaddeus Stevens there, he would have hanged him on the spot and distributed his bones to the Confederate States as curiosities. And even though it cost him more than $75,000, which is like $2 million in our money, he considered it a cheap price to pay if it meant the elimination of slavery throughout the country. Now, so we have stoves made at his 2 different iron mills. We have a rubbing of his epitaph. We have books about him. We have newspapers about him, and so on and so forth. So, and if you come on Saturday or Sunday, you'll get a tour by Thaddeus Stevens. Okay. Otherwise, you'll get a tour. If you come on Wednesday through Friday, you'll get a tour by Ross Hetrick. So.
Well, if we talk about Ross, what incited you to become so interested?
Why am I obsessed with Thaddeus Stevens? Let's just put it straight. Well, let me ask you this, okay, before I begin. Do you think he's worthy of being obsessed about?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Major figure in history. Well, I was a big history buff from high school, okay, from high school time. I grew up in Virginia, okay, and you might be wondering, what's a Southerner being such a big fan?
I never looked at Virginia as being the southern states.
Growing up in the South, it was very Southern. It was very. It's only frankly, stepping out of character, I'm amazed at the politics in Virginia now, because that's just because of the expansion of Washington, suburbs. But in any case, I always considered myself a misplaced Midwesterner. Both my parents are from the Midwest, and most of my friends were from other than the South, because DuPont and General Electric set up factories in Waynesboro, Virginia, after the war, and they couldn't find any people smart enough from Virginia to be their management. So they had to get them from other places. And so that's why they brought in, people like my father. And so I grew up, very involved with history. In the 1980s, I read a complete biography of Thaddeus Stevens, and I said, well, this is really a great guy. And I figured I'd go up to Lancaster and see his house and his very inspirational grave. No house there. And I was looking for his grave. This is even in Lancaster. So I went to the local newspaper and walked in. This is when they still had switchboards in the front desk, and went up to the switchboard operator, this older lady, and I said, "Where's Thaddeus Stevens' grave?" She scrunched up her face and she says, "Oh yeah, he was the one that was only for blacks and nobody else." Okay, but she did know where the grave was, so she directed me to it. I was horrified by the condition of it. It was overgrown. It was tombstones knocked down, tree limbs down. And in fact, by the way, it's still it has been abandoned since the middle of the 20th century. It has been taken care of by volunteers, and I'm involved in an effort to actually have a group acquire it and set it up as a operating cemetery. So anyway, I was so horrified by it that I pledged to myself in the 1980s that I was going to start a Thaddeus Stevens Society, and I actually moved up to Gettysburg in 1995 because he had lived there, and the cost of living was cheaper there than Lancaster. And we started with a membership of 9 people, and now we have over 300 people, and 13 are in foreign countries. So I keep on coming across people who are just really big fans of Thaddeus Stevens. In fact, it's interesting, some of the big fans like Tony Kushner, the guy who wrote the screenplay for Thaddeus Stevens, or for Lincoln, was a big fan of Thaddeus Stevens. That's why Thaddeus Stevens is in the movie. Bob Dylan is a big fan of Thaddeus Stevens. He actually devoted a page to him in his memoir, and I would love to get a hold of him to get some contributions, but he is completely unavailable. So does that explain to you why I was so? And tell you the truth, it's just so much fun doing this. He's just such a great character to be. Yeah, okay, thank you. Probably too much. I should not smile so much.
Do we have a list of his library or his what he read?
Actually, the Lancaster Museum does have a book case full of his books. A lot of them were just law books. So they do have, and I think there is a list of his books also somewhere. I have to go through my file.
What do you think of Tom Paine? Was there any reference to
What's
Tom Paine? Did he come across in any of Thomas Paine?
I know he was widely read. I don't recall right offhand about Tom Paine exactly. I know he was very versed in the classics, as everybody was back then, and everybody could quote from the Bible. Now, you might wonder about his relationship with religion. He was a big supporter of churches. He rented pews in various churches. However, he didn't fill them. He rarely went to church. He one time he was asked by a constituent. The constituent had heard that he did not believe in God, and he said, "No, only idiots don't believe in God, and I particularly believe in hell for the person who libeled me." But at the same time, he's quoted as saying to a seminary student, he said, "Go preach the gospel, but never try to prove it." So anyway, because his mother was a very devout Baptist, okay, and there's a story about how his mother was giving him a hard time about not going to church, and Thaddeus was saying, "Well, what difference does it make if you're in a state of grace?" And she looked at him and said, "Thaddeus, you're not in a state of grace." So she was pretty hard on him.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Let me get you a bottle of water.
Okay, sure, that would be nice. So this is free. This is the card to send. And this is that's $2. This is a rack card about the museum.